Hi, everybody. Hello, friends. Happy Friday after Thanksgiving, Black Friday. You going shopping? I bet you aren't. Hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving. Friends, family, a Friendsgiving maybe? Who did you hear from? Who texted you? Who said they were thankful that you were in their life? Who did you reach out to and say that you were thankful for? I know who I'm thankful for. All of you listening to the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast, all of you subscribing on Patreon. Man, that is inspiring and motivating. And I can't thank you enough. So I'm going to just keep doing podcasts 3 days a week with smart people, keep adding to them, and hoping that you'll keep listening because I love doing it. And it's the end of November. Thanksgiving is over, and this is the Friday episode. And I could not be happier that my guest today is one of the wisest, most thoughtful people I've ever met in my life. Several years ago, while I was hosting my show on SiriusXM, we would get periodic calls from a guy referring to himself simply as Peter. His calls were full of wisdom and wit and insight that set him apart from, I guess, the normal caller, who was usually pretty sharp to begin with. At some point, I think I must have asked him to email me, and that's when I found out that this very wise man who referred to himself as Peter was actually the actor Peter Coyote. Once I figured that out and learned about him and his work and his background, I asked him to join me as a scheduled guest, which happened from time to time, callers turning into guests, and he was an instant hit with my audience at SiriusXM, and I'm sure he's going to be a favorite guest here on the podcast. A couple of weeks ago, I was having a particularly bad day, feeling kind of lost and confused, as you sometimes do, and my wife, my rock, Valerie, suggested I reach out to Peter Coyote for guidance. Thought that was an interesting idea. We hadn't talked in a couple of years, so I didn't know what to expect when I texted him. He got right back to me, and we made time to talk, and we had a long talk this past Tuesday night. I called him again Wednesday to tape a chat. Here now is my first of hopefully many conversations here on the podcast with the narrator of the Ken Burns documentaries, Zen Buddhist Priest, my friend and mentor and teacher, Peter Coyote.
I am very happy to have our next guest joining us. He's an ordained practitioner of Zen Buddhism. He's a very politically engaged man, his whole life. He began his work in street theater and political organizing in San Francisco. He has acted in over 140 films, including with some of the most prestigious people, directors like Steven Spielberg and Steven Soderbergh, and, well, a lot of directors not named Steven, too. He's won Emmys, he's won all kinds of awards, and, of course, voiced award-winning documentaries for Ken Burns like The West, The National Park, The Dust Bowl, Prohibition, The Roosevelts, and so much more. And he is one of the all-time favorite guests on my SiriusXM show, and I'm very proud to say he has become a friend, a mentor, and a teacher of mine. So happy to have Peter Coyote on the line in his home in Northern California. Is that right, Peter? Is that where you are?
Yep, up north, about an hour and a half north of the city. Pete, just one small correction, two small corrections.
Okay.
One, it's 160 movies. And second, you forgot to say how I was found in the bulrushes.
How are you found in the bulrushes?
No, I say that when people give these flowery introductions that make it seem like I'm some figure from times past. I'm thinking about Moses and the bulrushes. So
you are times present. You have taught me as much as anybody to be in the moment, and I'm very excited to be in the moment with you right now in conversation with you again. It's been far too long. We had a private conversation last night, and it was so inspiring and enlightening and motivating and helpful. And I will forever be in your debt for that and all of the conversations I get to be in with you. Is it right, sir, that as I'm looking on the IMDb website, that you are portraying Robert Mueller in a new television miniseries?
Yeah, can you believe that? It's a small role, but it's such a good cast. They're doing a 4-hour miniseries of Jim Comey's book. I think it's called The Green Room. It's going to be on CBS, and there's one sort of important scene with Robert Mueller when the baton gets handed over, and Jeff Daniels is playing Jim Comey, and Holly Hunter is playing, I think, Sally Yates, and Bill Kelly from House of Cards. I think he's playing the FBI agent, maybe that has an affair. I'm not sure. But I wanted to be in this company. And even though I'm pretty much retired, I said, yeah, sign me up.
You're pretty much retired. Why?
Well, I just got tired of filming. You know, the last big series I did was called The Disappearance in Canada. It was a 6-hour miniseries, great script, great cast. It was 37 below zero on my last day of work. And what's happened in the film business is that other than the stars, everybody's wages have been beaten down. The crews, the other actors, there's no longer a quote where you would earn a certain level of income, and then they would expect that on your next film you'd get a little bump. After the leading actors in Friends all got together and demanded $1 million an episode, the producers said, we're never going to let that happen again. And they just began crushing everybody's wages. They knew there's 100,000 actors out of work at any time. And so they say, well, this is what we've got for the part, take it or leave it. And I just found myself angry in this really good company. The producers were in an office. They were toasty and warm. They were making their money, and we were just working like dogs, and you just don't get ahead. So my kids are graduated with graduate degrees. They're debt-free. And I thought, I just don't need to do this anymore. I'd rather stay home and write my books. And so that's pretty much what I'm doing. And the movie industry hasn't seemed to have missed me.
I loved your last book, The Rain Man's Third Cure. Of course, you wrote another book, Sleeping Where I Fall, and you're working on a third book. Do I have that right?
No, the third book is the third book is teaching me humility. It's done, and it's so far been rejected by 3 publishers. It's a strange book. There's no elevator sales pitch for it, which may have something to do with it. But it's called The I, like the letter I, Inside the Mask. The subtitle is The Lone Ranger and Tonto Meet the Buddha, How to Get Out of Your Own Way.
I like it.
So for about 40 years, I've been working with masks and going around to various Zen centers and various groups and teaching them that a mask with just a little warm up, half a morning, will just eradicate your personality temporarily. And you'll be taken over by another personality in the mask. And when your old personality goes, so does your insecurity, your second guessing, your self-doubt, and you experience a kind of freedom that's like enlightenment light. And so by the time you've done 3 masks and found 3 different characters, you're ready to understand Buddha's observation that there is no fixed self inside us. Yeah, by the time you've tried on 3 masks and discovered 3 different characters, you realize you're stone cold sober. You are ready to believe that the self is not a fixed entity or a fixed geography in the brain. And if you want to cement that feeling of freedom, well, I use that experience as a lost leader to get people to meditate and to get them to understand a Buddhist description of reality. The same with psychedelics. You know, you have a peak experience, but if you don't cement it with some kind of daily practice, your old habits will take over. So this book is about that, and it has all the exercises that you do, and a lot of the things that I learned in acting are useful in this kind of enlightenment light thing. But it's not easy to explain, and so far I've had no takers.
Well, I'm a taker. I'm interested in it, as I am all of your teachings and the teachings that you have learned and shared with so many others. But let's go back for you. When did you discover, when did you become ordained, and why? When did you discover Zen Buddhism?
Well, I started practicing Zen Buddhism in about 1973 or 4 after the counterculture. My dad had died. We had lost our land base. We had lost the land base of several communes. And, I was a single father with a daughter and flat broke. My dad had died so far below broke, it was, unredeemable. And my farm had to be sold for debt. And I came to San Francisco and I was getting over a long run with heroin. And I really knew I had to change my life. And so I started sitting Zazen at a local Zen Buddhist monastery run by a very great teacher named Suzuki Roshi. And I went into therapy. And I did that for 2 years, and my therapist died, and I started over with someone else. But I never quit meditating and sitting. And then about 12 years ago, my teacher asked me, would I do this priest training? It was a 3-year, like a divinity school almost. And I said, yeah, but I'll do it for you, but I'm never going to be a priest. That's just not going to happen. And so this course was it was a weekend a month for 3 years. And I was so impressed by the other people that were in the class, many of whom were already teachers and stuff, that I just had to raise my game. And so I said, okay. And so he ordained me as a priest. And then about 6 years later, I received transmission. No, it must have been 7 years later, I received transmission. And that's when your teacher sticks a meat thermometer in you and says, you're done. And basically that your mind and his mind are like sharing the same eyebrows. And so at that point, he transmits his authority to me. And I could ordain my own line of priests and set up my own lineage and stuff. But I told myself I would wait 5 years before I did formal teaching. And so I'm in that fourth year now.
What did meditation do for you when you first started in the early 70s, and how has your practice evolved?
Well, the first thing that meditation shows you is how wiggy, crazy, and busy your mind is. Because when you make the commitment to sit with yourself with no distractions, no reading, no fidgeting, no TV, no checking your phone, it's just you and your mind. And it's a pretty tangled up ball of barbed wire. But as you go on, you realize that it's not the mind that's the problem. It's that we are attached to it. We believe everything we think. And so we get jerked around back and forth by the mind, and it gets exhausting. And so one of the things that happens with meditating is you're paying close attention to your posture. And you have this little thing you do with your hands called a mudra. And you're concentrating on your breath, your exhales. And you sequester a certain amount of awareness to pay attention to those things, posture, breath, and hands. And that sequestration gives you like a little seat from which to watch your thoughts. And as long as you're in that seat, you're not hooked by the thoughts. There's a huge difference between saying, man, if he ever says that to me again, I'll slap the crap out of him. That's being hooked by your thoughts. You're in the drama. But if you're meditating and you're detached and you're watching your thoughts like you'd watch a movie, you say, wow, that made me angry. What part of that pushed my button? What part of that was a trigger? Let's look at this. So when you do this for a long period of time, all your old narratives come up. Eventually they get boring. Eventually they just fall away. And you're left with your breath running out of your nostrils, training yourself to be in the present moment. The past is a memory and the future is a guess. But right here, right now is where our life takes place. And meditating makes you feel like the back of your head is opened onto infinity, like open to the stars, and you have much more space and room. So your mind calms down by itself. You start paying attention to the little things that make up your life in this moment and in this day, and taking care of them. And little by little, even if you start with a little corner, the whole house gets clean.
So if the future is just a guess, you shouldn't be too worried about the future?
Well, everything that exists right now is a product of things that have happened in the past. And the future will be a product of things that are going on right now. So if we're taking care of the world right now, that's what we can do. I'm not saying we can't worry about the future. I'm extremely worried that by the time my granddaughter is 40, there's going to be 30% less oxygen for people to breathe because the phytoplankton in the ocean, bigger than the Amazon, more green matter than anything on Earth, has already lost a third of its capacity. And by 2050, it will no longer be able to synthesize, turn CO2 into oxygen, which means that our kids will be living at like 10,000 feet. So, yeah, I'm worried about it, but all I can do is attend to it and take care of it right now.
All meditation is not equal. You've been meditating since long before it became kind of, I don't know if you would call it mainstream, but there are now apps for it. There are books, there are podcasts, there are different forms. As you know, I studied the transcendental meditation with Bob Roth, but you suggested to me the other night that I amend it, try something different. What's the difference between different sorts of meditations, and how happy are you that so many more people have found some kind of practice of meditation for themselves?
Well, let me start with a little story because I don't want to sound like I'm putting down transcendental meditation. I have friends who are sort of the world experts at Dodge power wagons, old Dodge power wagons, like military style. And my truck is a 1952. And they live out in Fairfield, Iowa. And I was out there working on this truck that I was building. And we went for coffee. And the first thing I noticed was this is a fabulous coffee shop. The second thing I noticed that people that sat down to join us were really on the one. They were not being aggressive. They were not being overly deferential, which is stuff you get even as a third tier celebrity. People are not always just themselves. And this happened day after day after day. And finally, I turned to my friends and I said, what is it with this place? What's going on here? And they laughed and they said that years ago, the Maharishi had bought Parsons College and turned it into the Maharishi Institute. And they'd come there as students. They'd graduated into being professors and teachers. And then they graduated, they got tired of the bureaucracy and they built their lives there. And so it sort of wiped out a prejudice of mine. Many, many years ago, I thought that the Maharishi was just like, pop music. And I was kind of snobby about it. But being in this town, I realized that meditation is a fantastic technology. And it just really works. And it sort of doesn't matter what flag you fly under. My difference with sects that make you get a mantra is that it kind of contains things. It doesn't open it up. You have to get your teacher, you have to get a mantra. And I really believe in the democratization of consciousness.
Right.
Anyone can sit down, anyone can follow their breath, anyone can start to pay attention. And I don't want somebody else's voice in my head. I want to attend my voices in my head.
Oh, I like
and
that.
If they're sick, I want to heal them. And if they're not sick, I want to attend them. And sometimes they stop altogether. And that's really delicious. So, yes, there are many sects of Buddhism and meditation. Christians meditate, monks meditate, Jesuits, meditation is a deep human practice. And I think it started with early hunters who had to sit still and watched cranes and frogs and hunting dogs poised and absolutely still. And I think from the experience of doing that, people became introduced to the formlessness of their true nature and the vastness of it. So some sects of Buddhism, like the one that chants Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, that's more of a faith practice. Catholicism would be a faith practice. Christianity would be a faith practice. I like Zen because it doesn't ask you to take anything for granted or accept anything on faith, except once upon a time, a guy named Buddha lived. He was a historical figure, and he worked out a method of teaching people. And here it is, and you can try it, and you can test it. And if it doesn't make sense to you, walk away. So that's why that's what I found. That's my practice, and that's what I'm qualified to teach. And so I just gave you an idea to try something without a mudra. Try just emptying yourself out and following your breath and seeing what's going on inside your skull.
As soon as we're done here, I'm going to do it. I got some time, and I'm gonna give it a shot, just the way that you described it to me, and I'll report back to you. But you described it to me on that other conversation, but you just said, in terms of not needing the mantra, I've been using that mantra that they gave me, and it's basically a word or a sound, however you want to describe it. And I like the idea of just listening to my breath, but I've always felt like meditation, like I wasn't good at it if I was thinking, if I was seeing all these thoughts and my mind was jumping all over the place, that I was failing, that it wasn't working. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a mistake. And it's an unfortunate mistake, because there's a reason the ancient Indians called the mind the monkey mind, because it's hopping from tree to tree. It's seeking sensation. It's seeking fruit. It's seeking whatever. So what concentrating on your exhales does is train the mind day after day after day to come into the present moment. And the more you do that, the more all that thinking becomes superfluous, and the brain just starts to save its energy, and it slows down on its own. The purpose is not to stop the mind. Death will take care of that. The purpose is to become intimate with it. And the more intimate you are with it, and the more you investigate what you've been keeping from the light, and the more you investigate your narratives and your myths and your things like that, the more at home with yourself you'll be.
In your book, The Rain Man's Third Cure, you describe a lot about your whole life. You talk about your life. It's fascinating, your life is, that you've lived and the things that you've done and seen and experienced. But this idea of the counterculture, people my age, kind of 40-ish and younger, didn't experience it. Maybe they didn't read about it. But what was that period of time for you? What were you doing, and how did it determine any of the rest of your life?
Well, first and foremost, it was hopeful. And secondly, it was based on a kind of entitlement that we had to get disabused of. So in 1962, I helped organize a group of 14 people, and 12 of us went to Washington to picket the White House. We went on a 3-day fast, and we were supporting President Kennedy's peace race, and we were calling for an end of the resumption of nuclear testing. The Cuban standoff with the Russians had occurred. American culture was full of the atom bomb. Movies like On the Beach were coming up, and we were afraid we were not going to get to live long enough to be adults. And Kennedy saw us, and we had been pretty clever. We were all well-dressed and, being dignified. And John Birchers were teasing us and eating fried chicken in front of us. And Kennedy invited us in the White House. And it was the first time that protesters had ever been invited in the White House. And just before we went in, our spokesman, a guy named Mike Horwat, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Pete, you take this one."
Wow.
And so Kennedy was flying to Phoenix or something, and he set up a meeting with McGeorge Bundy, who was his national security advisor. And we got in there, and we thought we were bringing intelligence from the field to help educate our elected officials and show them what young people were thinking about, and they're just being good citizens. And I sat down and I looked at McGeorge Bundy. I was 3 feet away, and I realized that we were no more important to him than if he was the Queen Mary sailing away and we were waving on the docks. we were a problem to be solved for his president. End of story. And I realized that the only way I was ever going to get the attention of a guy like this was to come back with an army. And I realized I would never waste time again walking around in the street waving a sign, because I got a glimpse, close up and personal, of real power. So we were on the front page of the New York Times, and we took that article and we mailed it around to something like 2,500 colleges. And we had left 2 people back on campus, and we organized rolling protests. Other colleges came in before Facebook, before cell phones, before anything. This was like mimeographs and letters and phone calls and who do you know. And that went on until February of 1963, when the first 25,000 student demonstration took place in Washington. Tom Hayden called it the beginning of the student political movement. It's not quite true, because we were after the civil rights movement. But anyway, so when I got out of college, it seemed to me from the lesson that I had learned that my politicians were not going to be persuaded by reason. They were not going to be persuaded by passion. And so we really felt at that time that America was going to be on the verge of collapse. We were young and we were ready to go. And so one of the things that came out of that was a radical street theater. And after a while, that didn't seem like it was enough. And a bunch of us founded the Diggers. And the Diggers believed that the core of this society was based on profit and private property. And we challenged ourselves to think up an alternative way to live and to make it real by doing it, just doing it. So we fed 600 people a day. We set up the first free medical clinics. We set up free stores where all the goods in the store were free and the rolls were free. You could come in and say, who's in charge? We'd say, you are. And if you just dropped your jaw and looked stupid, there was no sense blaming the pigs or the system. You've been offered an opportunity and you dropped the ball. If you said, wow, I'm in charge, well, let's move these shirts here. I hate the way they're, and let's get these tools over here. So we did that for a long time. And then we wound up felt like we were running soup kitchens. The young people kept running away and coming into the Haight-Ashbury. The city was doing nothing, and we were the last line of support, or the first. So we began moving out into communes, all up and down the coast of California, and trying to build land bases and trying to come up with alternative ways of living that were more sustainable. And I'll tell you that if I could have gotten health insurance and education for my kids, I'd probably still be living on communes, because it was a wonderful life. We didn't have electricity for years, but you'd play board games, you'd play cards, you always had brothers and sisters to work with. And it was a funny reversal, because the only cash that we had was some of the women who had children were getting federal assistance, SSI assistance.
Right.
So all the men had to negotiate with them. Well, if you want your diapers, you got to help me fix my fuel pump. So we did that for a long time. And then because we didn't have a land base and because children came into the situation and demanded certain kinds of order, that we could no longer be as laissez-faire as we were when we were young, and the motto was, do your thing. So around, 73, maybe when Reagan was in office, or Jimmy Carter, it seemed as if the establishment had a policy. They didn't want another generation of kids who were active and engaged and making trouble. And they began defining us as a bunch of losers in bell-bottom pants and clunky peace symbols. And they steered the next generation into Wall Street and BMWs. That didn't work any better.
Right.
So I say that we lost the political battles at that time. We didn't end racism. We didn't end neoliberalism. We didn't end imperialism. We didn't end capitalism. We didn't end a lot of stuff. But we won all the cultural battles. the women's movement, the environmental movement, the organic food movement, alternative spiritual practices, Theravada Buddhism, Vipassana Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Wicca. The ways that people are actually living their lives were changed by the counterculture. And now we also have to take responsibility for the fact that we elected Reagan and Nixon. And we elected them by being too stubborn and too radical and too insistent on free love, long hair, open marriage, whatever our stuff was. And my fear today is that if the current crop of Democrats does not acknowledge and make adjustments for the social conservatism of the Midwest, the people between the Appalachians and the Rockies, we could see the same thing. We could lose again.
That's interesting. You think that whoever the Democratic nominee in this campaign is, they need to take into consideration more the interests and plight of who?
Well, look, let's just be frank. The reason that Donald Trump got elected is because for 40 years, the Democrats had ignored their constituency. They didn't defend the unions against Ronald Reagan when he fired all the air traffic controllers, and then the corporate sector declared war on the unions and on the National Labor Relations Board. They didn't defend rural people. It was under Jimmy Carter that Paul Volcker raised interest rates 5 points in a single day and bankrupted millions of family farmers who are now working as serfs in corporate agriculture, who lost the inheritance of their entire families because they had done just what they were told. They were told by every ag agency and industry that they should borrow money because their land values were going up. They should plow fence row to fence row. And when the interest rates went up, they went bankrupt. The leading cause of death on the family farm in the 70s was suicide. And for every 5 farms, you lost a business in town. So the entire Midwest became like a rust belt. And the Democrats did nothing. And then the laws that allowed corporations to ship jobs overseas, those were passed by people's elected representatives. I mean, come on, let's get real. Nothing happens unless the Congress okays it. So for 40 years, people have been left behind, lied to, bankrupted in the savings and loan scandal, which wiped out $280 billion worth of personal savings. And then 15 years later, under Clinton, they relaxed the laws on banking again, and we had the 2008 collapse, and we still have not recovered from that.
Oh, I know. I know.
Yeah.
We bought a home.
I'll bet you do.
We bought our home in 2007 and paid, at the inflated rate, Peter, at the bubble rate.
Yeah.
And then, we live in a suburb of New York City, which means home value has always gone up, except for the window of time that people and schmucks like my wife and I bought, and now we have no equity in our home, very little equity in our home. That's 12 years later, at least. That's why I'm just putting a fine, specific, personal point on. We still haven't recovered, and let's take a bubble. Let's take a point. I have nothing but respect for President Obama, especially in this day and age where we see what a crappy president looks like. He is like a shining light on a hill. But when you think that he got more small donations from people than any other president, that was 40% of his budget for the election. The other 60% came from the people who should have gone to jail in 2008. The Jamie Dimons, the CEOs, the mortgage brokers, the rating agencies who lied. And 6 million families a month were being evicted. 6 million families having their stuff put out on the street. Do we wonder why there's rage and why people perhaps fell for Trump's con act? He said all the right things. He told them the system was rigged. He railed against the elites. He just didn't tell them that he was one of them and he was going to screw them. So that's why we have Trump. We have Trump because of the failure of the Democrats.
And part of the failure of the Democrats is the self-congratulatory notions of urban elites who consider themselves the cutting edge, the super sophisticated. I went to school in Iowa. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I know how smart working people are. They may be more conservative than me, but they are not stupid. And right now, it's quite possible that the nation is so exhausted that they just don't have the bandwidth for an Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie, who would be my choices. But I'll tell you, I'd vote for a horse thief.
Yeah.
If he could beat Trump or she could beat Trump.
Yeah. Well,
so
yeah.
Here's the part that worries me. And I know I'm going on a little bit, but
I'm
I'll
interested.
stop with this.
Don't. Go ahead.
So here's the core problem, the taboo subject to talk about, the elephant in the room. Our entire electoral process revolves around the acquisition of capital, corporate capital and private capital.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because that was going to be my next question. So I hate to interrupt, because I want to encourage you to elaborate, because I told you that I had considered running for Congress, and you immediately told me you're glad that I decided not to, because of what you're saying right now about our campaign, our electoral system, and how important it is, how it all rests on how much money you get and where that money is coming from. So I interrupted you, but what is the issue?
Well, the issue is full federal funding of elections. When you see that 90% of the people want reasonable gun control, gun safety measures, and 10% don't, and the Congress votes with the 10%, it's as plain as the nose on your face that it's the Congress of the 10%. And the implied suggestion of all the media and the talking heads and everything is, if we can just get the right leader. Well, you couldn't have gotten a righter leader than Obama. And what did they do? They just cut him off at the nuts. They took his Supreme Court justice away. They blocked every single move that he could make. So when you have a system that revolves around capital, the people who are going to be most successful at it are going to be the people that can get capital. And the people who give them capital are not charitable institutions. They expect returns. And the problem is that the people can't see the returns. So this is how our system's broken down. The politician runs focus groups to find out what issues and buzzwords we'll vote for. Then they run for office. The ones that win get the keys to the public treasury in Washington. And then they begin their real work, which is paying back their donors.
Right.
And the way they pay them back is invisible to the public. It's through tax law. It's through sending people to their offices to show them how to skirt onerous legislation. And over the last 40 years, that's what's created the huge income divide in America. And of course, Americans don't know why, because unless you're as crazy as you and I, and you read 40 books about it,
right,
you won't know.
And if you don't know, then you don't. If you don't know what the root of the problems are, then you're not going to be able to understand what the solutions are, and you might end up, you mostly probably do end up blaming the wrong people, institutions, practices, and then following those mistakes that make the problems even worse.
Well, I think so. I mean, people blame Trump. You know, I love to throw tomatoes at him too, but he'd be nothing without the entire Republican Party. Well, when I was running the State Arts Council, my closest friend was a conservative Republican from Fresno named Carney Hodge. And he was a decent, reasonable guy. You could sit down, you could hash differences up without accusation and suspicion of motives. And now we have a 24-hour-a-day propaganda network in Fox News, and we have algorithms on Facebook so that everybody gets the news they want. When I was growing up, there were 3 networks, and the news was like the hood ornament on a Rolls Royce. Bill Paley, the president of CBS, told his reporters, "Don't worry about money. I have Jack Benny to make money." He wanted news, and we all trusted Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, Edward R. Murrow, and so we were all playing with the same facts. So little what's-his-face who runs Facebook, Zuckerberg, he can proffer his laissez-faire theories, but he's putting blatant lies under his logo.
Right.
Yep. Hillary Clinton is selling child porn through a pizza parlor. That it should not be allowable on public airwaves, which are owned by the public.
Yeah, it's a lie.
I don't think it should be allowed.
A lie can travel so fast. Something that didn't happen can just become believable. Whereas there used to be journalists that had editors that were, as you were saying, they were the loss leader of their network, but they had editors, they had sources, and if they got it wrong, then their credibility was damaged. There was a process with which how news was reported, and it was more trustworthy. And now that process, of course, is still in place with many of these media outlets, especially the newspapers, but it is about clicks and profit. And more importantly, the original point, the lie can travel so much faster, so much quicker, to the point that there are a lot of Americans that won't vaccinate their kids.
Yeah, and measles is coming back and polio is coming back. My dad used to say to me, life is hard for the stupid. But people aren't really stupid. They're misinformed by people who have a vested interest in selling them bad information. So, we still have great and responsible journalists. Don't get me wrong. The Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times. These guys are professional. These guys and women are professionals, and they are hunting and tracking Trump and his lies down little by little. But it seems to me that the public airwaves should have some standards of what can be communicated and what can't. And we are translating our Constitution into abstract ideas. The founding fathers had no idea that an AR-15 would ever exist. Right. They understood that everybody had the right to a musket. Well, for us making that an ordination of biblical prophecy, look what we have. We have mass shootings every week. We lose more people than we lost in 9/11. So it's the same for the Congress and a whole host of laws that are related to the Constitution, but related as abstracts and not related as things that we require as common sense. Why should you be allowed to lie on television? Why should you be allowed to be anonymous on the internet? Well, I don't get it.
Let's talk about another thing that you spent a lot of your life dedicated to, which is ending or changing America's foreign policy. You've seen a lot in your life, and you've been dedicated to and been involved with journalistic endeavors to covering this. But what do you see as the problem? I mean, I think you refer to it as imperialism, and there's any number of different kind of words to describe America's foreign policy and how it has changed or not changed, gotten better or worse with different administrations, different governments. But how have you seen America's foreign policy in your lifetime evolve? How are we doing today?
Well, I've been watching the hearings probably like everyone else. And I have to say, I'm so humbled by the performance of the State Department people, Taylor and Kent and Fiona Hill. They're so knowledgeable. They're just Vindman, that soldier. Yeah. So I'm not no expert in foreign policy, but this is what I remember. I remember that I was born in 1941. So I remember that time growing up in the 40s and the 50s. The Marshall Plan decided that we needed to build a strong Europe. We needed to build a wealthy series of allies. They would be markets. They would be raw materials. They would be products for us. And through what looked like a kind of enlightened selfishness, we rebuilt Germany after the war. We rebuilt our bitter enemies. Same is true of Japan. Now, when I listen to people talking about pulling in our tent and cutting off foreign aid, cutting off other countries from development. I mean, it's in our interests to help every country on earth have solar power, to do green and sustainable ways of building their wealth. If they follow the economic model of China and the United States, we're done. We placate ourselves because the Paris Accords have said we need to hold carbon in the atmosphere, global temperature rise to 2%. Well, we're already at 1%, and it's a disaster. 2% is not a realistic figure. And the fact that you do not hear concrete plans like, well, maybe we can only drive every other day, odd license plates one day. Maybe we have to stop making 500 horsepower cars. Maybe we have to change the way we live, that it's not even addressed. And meanwhile, we are just blithely passing these intractable problems onto my grandchildren. So we got to get real. And I think one of the big things that's preventing us from getting real is that we live in an I culture. And Zen Buddhism, as produced by Japanese culture, is a we culture. Most indigenous cultures around the world are we cultures. I was just in Africa with some Maasai people, and they were telling me everything is we. Everything has to be based on what's good for the group. And I think that what we're seeing is the bitter fruit of centuries of self-interest, self-promotion, putting the self first. And that's why you get multi-billionaires who don't want to pay their taxes or don't want to put a 2-cent wealth tax. It's why they'll give money to little orphans in Africa, but they won't pay their taxes so every public school in America could come up to par. And I think it's all a kind of greed that's based on an idea of a separate self that can win or lose on its own.
The I culture creates few winners, and the we culture creates many more winners. There are always seemingly winners and losers in any kind of culture and economic system, but the idea that there are so few people with so much money and so many people with so little money, and I mean not only money, I mean however you define wealth and happiness and health and access to education and health, the wealth concentration and the wealth gap has grown so much. And the only way to really change that is to evolve into a we culture, it would seem. That seems, it does, I don't like binaries, but it does seem like a pretty accurate one. I culture versus we culture.
Well, binaries are sometimes useful. There's one book, there's 2 books that I want to recommend that people read. One is called Winner Takes All, and it's by a guy named Anand Giridharadas.
Yeah, he's great. Love him.
Yeah, right. And so he was groomed to be one of these elites, and he saw through the game, and he dropped out, and he's explaining it to the rest of us. There's another book. I'm trying to search it up right this minute.
Is the other book Don Jr.'s new book? I hear that's pretty good.
No, it wasn't. I've overlooked that one.
Oh, huh. How elitist of you.
This one is by, I think it's How Washington Abandoned the Middle Class. That's not the full title. It's by 2 young economists, one from Berkeley and one from Princeton, who just analyzed the wealth gap and figured out that it had nothing to do with computers or education or globalism or anything. It had to do with the fact that the 1/10 of 1% was paying for both campaigns. And these 2 books, Winner Take All Politics, I think it's called.
Winner Take All Politics by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson is one of the most.
Yeah, Hacker and Paul Pearson.
Oh, yeah, those guys, right. They've collaborated on a couple of books now. I've interviewed them both. I'm so glad that you suggested them. Really, really great work. Yeah, it explains a lot.
those two books, Winner Take All Politics and Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, you can see the elite and the wealthy are greening their reputations, but basically they're guys in the country club that don't want to pay their share.
Right.
They're saying, well, I don't use the pool. I don't want to pay for the pool. I don't use the squash court. I don't want to pay for it. And we're all suffering as a result. And until we get congressional representatives that work for us, that we pay, then it should be illegal for lobbyists to give them anything, give them lunch. And then you begin to attract people who really want to serve.
Right.
I know that there are great people in Washington. Believe me, I'm not tarring everyone with the same brush. But the best people are faced with draconian choices. And my example is, let's say, Barbara Boxer, who's a personal friend, somebody I respect. She's put in a position where she has to vote $1.5 billion for the F-22 fighter jet that the Army didn't want, the Pentagon didn't want, nobody wanted except its stockholders. So she has to say to herself, Jesus, if I don't do this, I'm not going to get elected. And if I'm not elected, I can't fight for the environment. I can't fight for the rights of women. I just can't do it. Well, why should we allow capital to trump ethics, morality, good public policy? Until we pay for our elected representatives, until we give them enough so that they don't have to accept legal bribes, we can then make it illegal for lobbyists to give them a nickel. And we can make it illegal for them to take a job in any company they've supervised for 5 years. You know, when who's the woman in Pakistan, Pete, whose father was hanged? Benazir Bhutto.
Right.
Someone was questioning her about corruption in Pakistan. And she said, oh, really? You know, we take the bribes at the beginning of the deal. You take it at the end of the deal. And she was referring to the sweetheart deal where regulators, congressmen get called into the businesses they've given sweetheart deals to. So
she was assassinated in 2007.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too. It's always, whenever I hear her name, I think about, wow, Pakistan had a female leader in 2007. Do you think, I mean, that's another big part of our culture that doesn't get enough talk. It's getting more talk, but just the patriarchy in our country, there are certainly elements of it in other countries, including countries like Pakistan, which are very religious. But what is it about our country that is so afraid of women and is so afraid of not being masculine and tough, these gender identities that seem to hold us back both in the private sector and the public sector and all parts of our life?
Okay, this is all related to another problem and another book.
All right.
So there's a great book that was written in the 70s by a guy named Edgar K. Friedenberg. And the book's called The Disposal of Liberty and Other Industrial Wastes. And the book sets out to find out why Americans are so mean-spirited about helping people, why they're so fixated on people getting something for nothing. The data is in all over the world that if you just give poor people money, you will end poverty. They invest in themselves, they invest in education, they use it wisely. But in America, we don't do that. We build a totally expensive institution that will humiliate people and make them crawl for the little bits of money that are left after we pay all these middle-class salaries and people making sure there's no fraud. Well, it's of a piece. And what he says is the following. He says that many people work in businesses where the clients aren't free to refuse the services offered to them. He calls them reified clientele, welfare, the army, convicts, school children, social services. And so because the clients don't have any right to change or alter the relationship with the employees who offer them the services,
Okay.
They don't care how they do their work. they're not engaged in their work. The client, not the clients, but the people offering the services. So this leads to a kind of bitterness, a kind of feeling that your time is wasted. There's no standards you have to live up to. And more people are involved in areas like this. So when women come into the picture, or when race comes into the picture, what I think we're seeing, anyone who has to stand on race as a distinguishing characteristic is telling you they have nothing else. And anyone who has to oppress a woman is telling you they have nothing else, that they're unable to compete. They're unable to have the confidence or do the extra work to compete as equals. And that's what I think is going on, that we've gotten so fat and lazy from getting corporate money and salaries piling in for work that nobody cares about. It's not enriching anyone, making widgets. It's just a salary. And we overlook the fact that this job, this all precious job we talk about, actually consolidates the fundamental theft. Years and years ago, when armed guys came into the neighborhood and they said, we'll protect you from other armed guys, you give us 10% of what you have, but it's all ours. And now, 4, 5, 6 centuries later, we have strong men begging for jobs. Where's the freedom? Where's the dignity in that? And now those jobs are being taken away by robotics.
Right.
So men and women, various races are all in competition for a diminishing return, a diminishing pool. So there you have it.
Have you thought about this idea of the income, what's it called? The universal basic income, UBI, that Andrew Yang is pushing, and a lot of other economists predict that is going to be necessary for every society in the world, the more automated traditional jobs get.
Do you know who the first person was that proffered that in American political life?
Who?
Richard Nixon.
Is that right? What did he say?
$19,000 a year. He saw it coming. The poor are not going to dry up and blow away. And the reason we give them welfare today and the reason we humiliate them is just basically to keep them out of the garbage cans. But if you look at the vast communities of homeless people, if you look at the exhaustion of people that are doing 3 and 4 jobs at the same time, you see it's just not working. You can't have, 10 people owning as much as the bottom 50%. And the fact that they would resist paying their fair share in taxes is...
what is that? That's hilarious. It sounds
somebody's trying to reach me on the other line, and they're not taking that I'm picking it up and hanging up.
Oh, that's what you're actually doing. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm answering the phone and hanging it up. Anyway, so here we are again. The pool's drying up. The wealthy are taking more and more share of it because they're operating off an ethos that they've done it on their own. The money they made on our highways. They made with our employees educated by our education system.
Right.
They made protected by our legal system. They made protected by our police and fire department. Nobody does it on their own. And these services are expensive. And if you had to pay for them on your own, they'd be more than your taxes. So somehow, after 50 years of Ronald Reagan, taxes have been defined as an evil, right, as depriving you of your freedom. People say, well, I can decide what to do with my money. Oh, really? So if you don't have any kids, you don't want to invest in public schools.
Right.
Or if you live in the country, you don't want to invest in a good electrical system in the city. That's why we elect leaders to have an overview and representatives to have an overview and hash these things out. But when they're under the control of private capital and corporate capital, they are not serving the public interest. They're serving their own interest.
I've done an hour with you. I could do 10 more hours. Your phone is ringing. Your time is in demand, but it's so appreciated that you spent it with me. This is hour one of our conversation on this new podcast. I hope that we can get as many hours logged away in many ways as we can. I want to come out there and spend some time with you, but I really appreciate you joining me today, Peter Coyote.
Well, thanks, Pete. I promise I'll rant less next time.
No. If you ever rant less, I'd be upset. This is what we have you here. I love to listen to. I love to be able to fire these questions at you, your life's experience, your education, your ethics, your morals. Everybody loves it. I mean, not everybody loves it, but certainly people enjoy hearing it and are welcome, as I know you do, to challenge any of it because you're always up for it. Thank you, sir, for joining me, and I will talk to you hopefully really soon. All right.
Talk to you again. Bye, Pete.
Yep. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mr. Coyote. What a fascinating guy he is. I know we're all over the place with a number of different ideas and issues and approaches, but we're just going to keep having that conversation with Peter and many of our other guests who are deep, thoughtful, wise people. So thank you so much for listening to today. I hope you'll consider subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating and adding a Patreon subscription for as little as $5. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic will help support us. Right now, we're still ad-free. I'd like to stay that way, although everybody says you can't and that you've got to go with a podcast distributor or network. But right now, it's just you and I'm loving it. So thank you very much for putting up with any of the technical issues. We're getting better each and every episode. And I'm home right now in my childhood bedroom, hoping to tape a conversation with both my parents about their lives and share that with you, as well as doing stand-up here at the Funny Bone in Syracuse, New York, where I'm taping my new special on Saturday night. So fingers crossed that goes well, and I'll have that out and release it to Patreon subscribers first. You'll be the first to see it, and then we'll go with a wider release soon after. Okay, have a great weekend. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast. My best to you and your family. And as always, be the change that you want to see in the world, and death to single-use plastic. Talk to you Monday.